We went from an environment where people were calling in saying, my mortgage payment's about to double, help me, versus a consumer that's now getting 6 to 10 calls a day because they asked for an auto insurance quote, right? So that the dynamic has completely changed. I think we went through a period where the compensation was a big part of it, and there were bonuses and incentives being paid on a per transaction basis. And that, as a result, I think degraded quality. I think it deteriorated the reputation of the industry for a period. What is it that you need for me to get started? And if all we get is, just send the data to this API, or, send the CSV file or zip file to this email address, for me, that's a red flag right out of the gate. Leveraging AI for those types of consumer engagement, I think, will continue to grow. And I'm in favor of it because I think it gives people choices. And it allows us to know that if the phone rings at 2 p.m. this afternoon and I'm expecting that call, I know what to expect when I answer it.
Hey everyone, welcome back to First Contact Stories of the Call Center. This is the show where we uncover the unexpected journeys of the people shaping customer experience in the contact center world. Now, today's guest, Joe Laskowski, has been here for over 3 decades, mastering the art of building businesses in America's most regulated industries. Now, for those that don't know Joe, a little bit about his background. As a founder and CEO of the Saguaro Global Consulting, he's been a fractional executive for companies that need to navigate TCPA compliance, optimize call center operations, drive revenue without triggering those regulatory nightmares. And look, for those that want to even get deeper into his history, we could talk about his time with H&R Block. We can talk about all the education marketing ventures, him being a COO at Pace, a CRO at Motorama Media, and look, even over 8 years on the Consumer Consent Council board. But with that said, I don't want to take away all of what we're going to talk about with Joe's story. So Joe, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Christian. Happy to be here.
Hey, look, we always start this conversation around your journey because we always talk about this joke about how did you get in this space? Because no one really grew up and said, hey, I'm going to work in the contact center space. But eventually those of us that get in here, once we're in, we don't end up getting out. So what was your story in the early career up into getting into this space into where you are today?
Sure. Ironically, I started my career in consumer finance. And that was back at a time when the phone rang to the receptionist and she transferred you the call. And if you were calling a consumer for sales or otherwise, you picked up the phone and you dialed it. So it wasn't until a little bit later in my career that I was introduced to it. When I migrated to mortgage banking, I was working for one of the largest non-prime wholesalers in the United States. And that was my first experience with seeing what a massive contact center looks like. Because they were servicing the mortgage portfolio as well, thousands, if not tens of thousands of calls per day. And my office was very close in proximity to that. So I was able to spend a lot of time in that center, and there was a lot of crossover in staffing. So I was exposed to a ton very quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting how you get your foot in the door into that space. You start getting exposed to this huge organization. But through that, up to what you're doing today, you've had a lot of different views on what we call the overall sets of industry that touches the contact center. You said obviously in the finance, as well as, we've talked about other things in your past, like running your own centers and then also lead generation. So talk about how you went shifting through these journeys and what made you go from one type of business to a completely different type of business.
Sure. The call center that I mentioned in the mortgage servicing group, I ultimately identified a business opportunity there when we were acquired by H&R Block. At the time, they were a prime lender. They were not just a tax preparation company. And because the popular product was a 2-year arm, I simply said, we need to build a business that contacts the customers near the expiration of their 2-year arm and turn that into a revenue stream and book them in the H&R Block book of prime business. That was readily met with approval. And the next step was, okay, build a call center to make the outbound calls, script it, train it. At the time, we had a lot of people on our team that were from different parts of the world. And the decision was made to begin that operation in New Delhi, India, shortly followed by Pune and Guadalajara. So at the time, I was spending about 3 months a year in other parts of the world, creating an infrastructure around contact center, inbound calls and outbound calls that would get converted to mortgage conversions, mortgage closes. After the crash of 2008, I took a right turn in my career and was introduced to performance marketing. And it was shortly after that I landed at Higher Ed Growth with a good group of guys. We were education focused. We were working with a lot of call centers, trying different things in order to grow the business. And I started to see a pattern with some of the frustrations of working with third parties. We had no intentions of going into the call center business. And it actually happened from a gentleman trying to sell me leads. And a light bulb went on, and I said, well, what if we just bought your center? Fast forward 3 months, and we were call center owners in Costa Rica. So it was kind of ironic the way it all happened. At no point did I set my sights on building or managing a call center. It was part of responsibilities or other ideas that I had for revenue generation. So that's what led to the most recent venture of owning a call center on our own.
It's interesting that you go from this business that goes into this global organization that now has to figure out how do you staff people around the world, the potential cultural difference, time zones, hiring, training them to be able to meet the business outcomes and even the culture of the business. And then all of a sudden now you're getting into performance marketing, you're talking about lead generation, you're talking about definitely a lot of managing the performance of, leads. When you look at those two snapshots in time, do you see there were things that you were doing early on that really shaped and translated, or was it like you had to learn stuff all over and not a lot translated?
I think it's about half and half. Uh, Early on in the call center infrastructure, we were pretty early to the game in doing business in India. And at that point, I would argue to say there really wasn't drawing a blank, a middle income bracket. I'm losing the words right now. Everyone was either extremely wealthy or not wealthy at all in the least. So the opportunity for those jobs and that growth in that area was great, and it was at a lower cost, and all the reasons that companies originally went offshore. And the things that I did learn from that is the training fundamentals, the hiring practices, the way to staff, and getting an understanding of the turnover, because it is and can be a high burnout job. On the performance marketing side, I think you look at much different metrics, and you also now have the compliance component that we didn't have in the late 80s and early 90s. So there was a whole other layer of technology and things that we had to look out for. But the constants, I've always been a big believer in surrounding myself with people that are smarter than me or can do a particular job better than I would know how. And I think a critical component is having the right folks that are running those call floors, and that they have the respect of the individual. There's a fine balance of reward for a job well done. And they have to accept the fact that there is going to be turnover and be prepared for it, and have plans in place to constantly rotate and or offer people growth opportunities as team leads or other things. Without that infrastructure in place, I've seen just revolving doors of people burnt out and or beginning to not follow the rules.
Yeah, it's interesting you talked about compliance because I can just imagine all of us that look at time and see what was self-regulated or regulated through various means. Over time, you look at it and you say, okay, I'm going from maybe this mix of talking to my end customer, H&R Block, maybe cross-selling or upselling. You got these communications, and then now you have this world in which you're in this performance marketing space and there's potentially a lot of rejection in the workload for outbound communications. There's a lot of compliance risk if you don't do the right thing, and it could literally just put you out of business. So from a mindset perspective, how do you look at that kind of business back then to now and say, what are the things that the staff had to take into account, whether it was the agents themselves, the managers, all the way to the department heads or even leaders of the business? How did you still get people to be motivated to really understand how to get the outcomes you wanted, understanding that there's that turnover, understanding there's all this compliance risk? How did you balance performance and the compliance?
I think in the early years with the original center, particularly outside the country, it was a lot easier because the compensation was very generous for what they were accustomed to. There didn't need to be, per call, per transfer bonus types of things. There were contests, there were incentives, there were things like that that were being used to motivate the team. And because they were considered really good jobs at the time in those markets, turnover was a little bit lighter. Fast forward to today in the call center environment. First, it's extremely competitive with the growth we've seen in outbound dialing. We went from an environment where people were calling in saying, "My mortgage payment's about to double, help me," versus a consumer that's now getting 6 to 10 calls a day because they asked for an auto insurance quote. Right. So that the dynamic has completely changed. And I think the way we look at call centers today is quite a bit different. In terms of the reward and the staffing, I think we went through a period where the compensation was a big part of it. And there were bonuses and incentives being paid on a per transaction basis. And that, as a result, I think degraded quality. I think it deteriorated the reputation of the industry for a period, and that brought a spotlight on the way things were being done because individuals would be pushing the envelope as far as they could because they had personal gain. So it's almost hard to do a comparison in the two, not only because of the amount of time that's lapsed, but because of the type of transaction that's happening.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that when we think about incentives, incentives don't always drive the outcomes you want or the behavior that you want, and being able to be keen on whether or not whatever you choose to drive behavior is the behavior you actually want, not at all expense, at your customer's expense, you get an outcome of, let's say, a sale or a transfer, but someone who's not going to actually keep the product or purchase or even want to go through because they felt that they were pushed in a way that they probably shouldn't. And I know when we talk about our people, we talk about how they're really representatives of our brand and at all parts of the touch points of the journey. And you've mentioned this philosophy of direct, clear communication and checking emotions at the door, right? And with that, how did you develop the management style around that concept, knowing that you were in this high stress, high rejection call center environment and still be able to manage through the no's?
Yeah, that's a great question. For the center we acquired in Costa Rica, there was a management infrastructure in place. The director that ran that call center floor was very well liked, very well respected. He was a great coach, he personal trainer in his personal time, right? He was very focused on helping people succeed, and that's the exact type of person you need in that role. My personality style is not suited for running a call center floor every day. And I know that, right? So I need somebody like that can do that job. and help manage the turnover and minimize it. We ultimately ended up turning over the C-suite there and let the director take the reins. And that was one of the best decisions we made because he was people first, and the team recognized that. And the results came from the way we approached our team and business, as opposed to trying to mandate that they do certain things or behave in certain ways or try to motivate them with money only.
It's from a cultural standpoint, when you were working within, let's say, the H&R Block stuff, or even for a brand versus owning your own center, obviously the control is different, what you can control, what you're able to bring in. But that being said, were there any major differences that surprised you when you started being able to manage your own and run your own center versus somebody else's center?
I think so. And a lot of it came from an improvement in the technologies and our ability to manage metrics at a more micro level. Those types of things didn't exist in the early days of my call center experience. And as time went on, it became necessary because the micro statistics that we now have access to give us glimpses or insight into what could become bigger problems if they go unaddressed. So there's no question that the evolution of technology and our ability to analyze data and do better at predicting, a particular outcome, something as simple as, call transcription software, right? Where before there was a room full of people that were listening to recordings to see if policies were being adhered to with a sheet of paper that they were checking boxes, right? And fast forward to today, and it's been advanced even more with AI. But you have the ability to identify red flags even at the individual agent level that wasn't there before. And that started to happen right about the time that we purchased our call center. And we used a lot of those partners to ensure that things were being done the right way. And although we had a great leader on the floor in that center, we're thousands of miles away and we're the ones carrying all the risk. So there had to be a way for us to measure at a distance and get access to recordings and, try to identify things that were potential problems that someone in the weeds every day might not have been able to do.
Yeah, access to data, what you do with the data, and the timeless of the data has always been a thing that we didn't lack data. It was how could you to make decisions on that data fast enough, and how you were accessing that data. But with that said, before you can have that meaningful conversation, before you can empower that agent or representative to have a meaningful outcome of that conversation, you still got to get people on the phone. And I know from when you first started dialing to now, the ways in which you can get a hold of a customer or prospective customers very different, in the sense that there's a lot of mediums that you can do so in the way today that you can do so. But there's also a lot of impediments in the way, right? There's a lot of filtering, a lot of blocking, a lot of how your brand is or isn't represented, the awareness of who's calling, and whether or not people still want to pick up the phone. And so with that said, you've talked about this shrinking pool of savvy prospects. When we look at the concept of outbound, whether it's a callback and it's a one-off call, whether it's an office calling somebody, or it's a true call center making a lot of outbound calls, how should call centers be adapting their approach to try to get a hold of people and still not run afoul of, compliance issues? What are the key things people are doing nowadays versus what you were doing before?
Sure. I think there's a lot more emphasis now on the reliability of the data, right? It has to start with consumer interest. There was a period in this space over the last 15 years where we know with certainty that the white pages, back in the phone book days, were being passed out in call centers, and people were just cold calling and doing anything they could to get a transfer, right, to consider it a successful event. Um, Now what I'm seeing from call centers, and a couple of weeks ago, I just put together an engagement with an insurance client and a call center that is going to outbound data for them. Their due diligence on the data that they would be dialing on was like nothing I'd seen before in our space. And I think that has evolved a lot, and I think it'll continue to evolve. Not only do the call centers not want the responsibility of TCPA risk or dialing on data that was not consented properly, but they want the success because the call center floors are expensive, the technology is expensive, and if the clients are not getting the results, oftentimes the fingers get pointed first at the call center and what they're not doing or not doing right, when in reality is the success or potential success of that transaction started well before that. And it's whether or not the data that was acquired was truly a request by the consumer, and also if that data is being circulated or sold multiple times and how many times. I'm in a position now where I have a front row seat to this call center arrangement, and I hear recordings where consumers are saying, you're the third person to call me this week. Well, that was not an exclusive record that was promised to that insurance buyer, right? So those are the types of things that we need to look out for. And when you talked earlier about obstacles, that's one of them. There's a varying degree of risk tolerance that's driven by revenue and profitability. And I think what we're going to see, we're seeing it, and I think we'll continue to see over time, that the organizations are going to have to adapt to the way they think and figure out a way to do it right, do the due diligence, and work with consumers that are truly interested in a product or service, as opposed to just finding ways to dial and collect hourly rates.
It's so interesting. We've talked about the concepts forever of know your customer, right? And we talk about it high level in many ways because of compliance and understanding things from the finance space, but also this concept of the customer journey. If you really know your customer, then you can meet them where they are, where they want to be, and you'll be able to better serve them as well when you're talking about your end customers. But even in this case, when you're talking about gathering the data and the intent of the person, or even awareness that they want to talk to you about a product or service, you may have a much higher success rate if they know that they're looking for something, you have something they want to offer, and there's some sort of connection between that. And so I know throughout your history, you've had moments where you've definitely seen where compliance breaks down, where you've seen other people doing the wrong thing, and you've seen what those warning signs were. And so what kind of things, if you're running a center or if you're even giving work to a center, what could they be looking for that you can sit there and go, yeah, this is going to be heading towards that regulatory trouble?
I think a big part of it has to do with the initial conversations with the call center and asking about their level of due diligence. What is it that you need from me to get started? And if all we get is, just send the data to this API, or, send the CSV file or zip file to this email address, for me, that's a red flag right out of the gate. There's call centers, and, there's some really good centers, offshore and nearshore, that are doing things the right way. And there's others that are not. And we have to be careful in doing business with the centers that are fully based outside the United States, because the reality is the contractual obligation that they have isn't worth the paper it's written on. I mean, trying to recover losses in international court, it's just not feasible, right? So I think one of the things that people are paying more attention to are not a problem if you have agents offshore. Is there a corporation or an entity that's based inside the United States that's taking responsibility for it. So I've seen a lot more questions around the location. It's often one of the first questions. Where are the agents located? Where's the company located? The use of the do not call list. I've talked to call centers outside of the U.S. in particular that, I ask if they're scrubbing against DNC and they didn't know what I was talking about. And what I prefer is that I get a list of things that we must be doing before the call center is willing to engage with us. And I think that's a good starting point for knowing that you have the right partner in place. But there's still things that we can't control. Once that data leaves the farm, there's really no way to know what happens to it after that. And there was also a period of time in our industry where I think data might have been resold without the knowledge of the original provider. So there's all kinds of things that have happened over the years. And I believe a lot of that is changing. So ultimately, the red flags come down to the initial engagement, the initial conversation with the call center, how they're doing business. And then once they're operating, small scale, let's test a few hundred records with a couple of agents. We ask for recordings now, sample recordings more than we used to. We also know they're going to put their best foot forward when you ask for them, right? And give you the best call ever. But I think that initial week or two with a new partner and listening to the consumer interaction, more importantly, the consumer than the agent. The agents are easy to train. They follow scripts. There's technology to keep them on target. Listening to what the consumer has to say is going to play a big part of that. And then I think that you mentioned this earlier, Christian, that the multi-touch point process is critical because, mobile devices exceed others at this point in terms of engagement. People are getting very accustomed to push notifications and text messages. And some people would rather communicate by text all day than they would by phone. So you got to look at your demographic. You got to look at the consumer. You got to look at what they want and try multiple touch points to see how they engage and what they prefer and be able to accommodate all of those. And if it's not within the call center partner or partners that you're using, I think it behooves the lead buyer to have those technologies or partners in place to use a multifaceted approach to communication.
This is James. James is a contact center manager with a passion for philosophy and hiking. As a kid, he made a promise to himself that he would always follow his passion. Today, he ponders on the thought that this promise is probably the best decision he ever made. Today, James loves his job just as much as he loves hiking. So much that he sometimes brings the scent of fresh pine and the tranquility of the mountain streams back to the office with him. With Nobel Biz as his company's provider, James found the necessary peace of mind to finally bridge the gap between his passion and his work. By choosing to partner with the promise-keeping voice and software provider of the industry, contact center technical issues, downtime, and poor customer experience are now a thing of the past. In an industry ruled by uncertainty, Nobel Biz combines balanced pricing with the highest quality, topped off with outstanding support. But above all, Nobel Biz delivers peace of mind to contact center managers and owners. And for the first time, James hit that sweet spot of focus and confidence that is allowing him to take his business to new heights of profitability and success. After all, you know what they say, promises are the uniquely human way of ordering the future. Nobel Biz, the promise keepers of the industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think if every call that I expected as a consumer happened when I wanted it and I was expecting it, and I knew that the person or company that was calling me was exactly whom I needed to talk to, I'm sure I would answer the phone more often. The unfortunate reality is many of the calls that hit our phones, we have no clue who they are. We don't have an interest in talking to them, and it may not even be a convenient time. And so sometimes when we talk about earlier, do you even want to talk to this person? Is there even intent because of whatever they signed up for, services or products they're looking for? Um, because of the lack of visibility, the lack of trust in the communication ecosystem today. And obviously, we look forward to a world in which it's a lot better. But with that, I think you're right. People do have to get primed with text. Maybe it's not convenient when you call them. Maybe they didn't even know it was you that was trying to call them, and vice versa. Maybe right now their preference is text or email or some alternative communication path. But from a regulatory standpoint, I know earlier we were talking about how AI is really starting to get into the mix. And it's the buzzword right now, just like omnichannel was and everything else, the IVR and anything we can talk about. There was this huge impacting innovation. And it's funny to see that people still don't know what the DNC is, because, of course, for the longest time, people thought Outbound was going to die because of that. But with the advent of AI being adopted more, or at least talked about more than ever, from your experience, either leveraging the technologies or seeing people use them, tell me about how you're seeing the adoption of the technology. Are people really adopting it right now? Are you seeing it as a consumer? And with that, do you see any compliance risks being created as people start to adopt these technologies?
Sure. I'll start with the last question first. I think because it is relatively new in terms of a way of communicating with consumers for the purpose of lead generation, especially, there's not a ton of case law right now. So I think the folks that are doing it right are they're kind of following the letter of the law based on if it were a phone call, right? There are SMS guidelines, but as it relates to chat bots and things like that, I think there's still a lot of unknown around whether or not that'll ultimately be treated differently as it relates to TCPA regulations or SMS, or, if that results in a text message, how do the carriers treat it? So I'd say more to come, but in the interim, the right way to do it would be to take a more conservative approach and apply the same rules and regulations. As it relates to the implementation in the process, it's interesting because I think this goes back to what you talked about in terms of the consumer engagement and when do they want to be contacted and what's convenient. And, the process that my business partner and I are working on for our own agency actually includes a multi-touch point. And we are taking form leads that come in real time. An outbound dial is happening immediately. If the phone is not answered, at the same time, a text message is going out asking for an appointment through a link where they could actually click into it and pick the day and time they want to talk. And an email is being sent. So through the multiple touch points of engagement, we should get a pretty good idea of the level of interest from that consumer, if they respond in one fashion or another, and how they want to be communicated with. So AI in that capacity, there's workflows that we're going to build that could even further qualify the consumer, right? We're a little bit different because we're doing our own internal marketing and it's all being generated in-house at this time. So we know where the lead came from, but we don't know exactly what they're looking for or why or when they want to talk. So leveraging AI for those types of consumer engagement, I think will continue to grow. And I'm in favor of it because I think it gives people choices. And it allows us to know that if the phone rings at 2 p.m. this afternoon and I'm expecting that call, I know what to expect when I answer it. So I think we've only scratched the surface on the role that AI is going to play. And I think it's a little early to tell from a regulatory perspective if it's going to go down a different path than what we're already experiencing.
It's interesting how you've kind of choreographed this experience with these different mediums, and you kind of have this methodical approach of how am I going to get this person to engage with me, but also to know that you have these different touch points for various reasons that we talked about earlier. And you've talked about this concept of removing the roadblocks as an approach for organizations to roll out technology quickly. So when you just went through this outline of the tech that you adopted to put this in play, what you just described, what are the kinds of things that we normally think of when you add new tech, right? There's resistance usually. People want it to be perfect before it gets rolled out. Maybe there's a compliance risk. Do we know if it checks the box? So from your side of it, what is your playbook? What is that approach that you use to say, how do I get this in, but quickly enough to get it done, but not so fast as creating chaos in the business?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we're living it at the moment. The saying about good, cheap, fast, pick two, right? Um, so we initially anticipated multiple technology platforms that would accomplish what we want to. In doing our due diligence, we've learned that there are some applications out there that already do all of it. To what degree is what we're still learning. So what I thought would be a week or two long implementation is now on week 3 and counting. And I think it's going to take longer than we expected. So maybe the answer to that, Christian, is that quick is not better than right. There's things that we could have done and had a process in place within 48 hours. But was it going to be the most efficient? Was it going to allow us to scale the hundreds of agents that live all over the country? Would it check all the boxes for compliance? The answers to those are no. And we quickly realized that we'd rather invest more time up front than and get it right than do it quick and have to use Band-Aids or make changes later. And that's the advice I would have for anyone in that position that's either starting in the call center world or a partnership or, in a startup phase. When you're putting together your timeline and your budget, you need to pad it because you're going to find along the way that you're learning things that will change your perception of what you thought was going to happen for how quickly you can implement. So, the days of months and months of due diligence and research and paralysis analysis, I think those are long gone. But I do think it's worth the investment of time and educating yourself on all of the options out there before you pull the trigger, and make sure that you keep the end goal in mind, right? We have a tendency to, starting a business costs a lot of money, and you want to see revenue to start to offset that. So we have a tendency to want to see incoming dollars as quick as we possibly can. That's the entrepreneurial spirit about what we do. But it takes some patience to be able to know that doing it quickly may cost you more later. And it could cost you big if we started getting into, compliance violations or fines or things like that. So that's kind of how we've bridged that gap. It was a little different than I expected, but worth the wait.
And there's so much to unpack there. I know we could have a whole call on the concepts of, do businesses, when they run lean, have dedicated staff and teams to do the due diligence on solutions? Are they the actual experts to choose the right solution? Who do you partner with when you find who to have as your short list of vendors? When you go to implement, do you have spare staff just sitting around waiting to implement the new technology while running the business, right? And that's never the case. No one ever has that. So they're always looking for get it done as fast as possible. And also don't be disruptive to the business. Oh, and make sure you're compliant. And you can go down the list, right? And as you can see, if you don't know the end in mind, you don't know what success looks like, if you don't have stakeholders in your business that you hold accountable as owners of getting this thing done, these things will probably never get done. Or when they do, everyone will point fingers at whose fault it was that it didn't get done or isn't a success. So with that said, though, as we look at adopting these new tech, even like AI in mind, are there any questions that someone, when they're looking to adopt new tech, should be asking their technology vendors that they're probably not asking when they're going into this new adoption?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to go back to something that you said about potentially not knowing the end game. And I think that's potentially mistake number one. It's one thing to come up with a great idea and say, hey, we're going to start doing this. But I think you're selling yourself short if you can't agree amongst the stakeholders what you want it to look like in 5 years. Are you building a lifestyle business? Are you looking for something, cutting edge that no one else is doing? Do you want to improve upon a consumer journey? Are you looking for an exit? Right. And I think the questions that you ask your partners and tech providers might be a little bit different depending on what that answer is. Our personal experience, there's myself and one other stakeholder, and we are doing every demo ourselves because we have different skill sets. We know what the end game is. And every one of those demos teaches us something and also gives us another question to ask the next demo. So in terms of the questions to ask, I mean, some of the most common that we talk to every service provider about would be, approximately how many clients do you have servicing this industry? Talk to me about support. What does it look like? Am I speaking to a human? Am I opening a ticket? Am I talking to a chat bot that will not answer my question and I have to wait for someone to get back to me? What does that look like? Implementation. It's great when you see what the per user cost is, or you budget out for the year what the technology is going to do. You also have to pad that and understand that, number one, there's probably add-ons. Number two, you're probably going to exceed some of the thresholds for what's included in that package. So those are all questions that need to be asked that they don't necessarily put in front of you up front unless you do. So those are some constants for us. And then I also like to ask who their competitors are, which sounds like a pretty basic question that everyone should know. But sometimes you get wrapped up in the technology and the time runs out. And we always make it a point to try to find out, who else is out there. And speaking to real-time experience again, this morning we did a demo and the gentleman ended up turning off the recording and telling us about another product that he think was better suited for our business. Not the kind of thing you expect normally on a sales call, but it happens. And it's part of the education process, and it potentially pointed us down a path that we weren't on before. So I think ultimately my advice and the summary of that advice is you got to figure out the end game, or at least what you think it is when you start. And then you have to be adaptable, create a short target list, but keep looking and listen for clues on those calls and the demos and see what you're willing to settle without. Because it's pretty hard to find a system that's going to check every single box. So you got to prioritize those boxes and then hone in on those and ask questions about those that are most important to the organization.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there as well. I mean, don't have the time today. Love to have another conversation that can dive much more deeply into all the things that when we look for tech, when we look for displacing the incumbent solution, what does that look like? How are you going to go about making that decision? But I think you're spot on with some of those key questions of, have they done this before? What do others people do that find success, in the solution? The idea that the customer knows everything about your product and how to optimize performance and drive outcomes, it's just unrealistic. And if that company doesn't know your business well enough and your use case well enough, it'll be hard for them to show you these wonderful outcomes that the marketing slicks say that you're going to get from the product. And I'm sure you've been on plenty of demos where you get the tour of everything in the world, but nothing but what was relevant to you. And that's not uncommon in a lot of tech sales. So With that being said, I'd love to be able to spend a little bit of time at the end here of our slot is a little bit more on this fractional leadership and personal side from you, Joe. So for those that have never hired someone who is a fractional executive, especially in the contact center space, where they may actually need some expertise, but they just really at the moment can't justify hiring or having that full-time C-suite hire. What kind of problems have you seen best get solved when you bring in a fractional leader? And what are the kinds of things that the contact center owner or even leadership should consider when they're bringing in outside help versus just solving the challenges internally?
I think there's this in and of itself could be a session too. So I'm gonna try to grab a few nuggets with the time we have left. So I think I'll speak to me personally because I can outline that journey based on what I've done. And if you look at the different roles I've held throughout my career and the different views I've had during those times, um, bringing a fresh set of eyes into an entity that has that type of experience is invaluable. We, I personally, you get wrapped up in your own business and you think you know exactly how you want things to be and you problem solve because that's what our roles are as an owner or stakeholder. But sometimes a fresh set of eyes or an idea coming from someone from the outside could be something that you would miss. Um, it's easy. It's easier than most think to get into the weeds and think that you know exactly what should be done, how it should be done, and how to problem solve within your own business. And I think to a certain degree, most good leaders do that. But what I've found is in every instance of my consulting engagements, folks were brilliant and they were running successful businesses and they either hit a ceiling. One-to-one was a big one. It was amazing how many companies were losing sleep. They were terrified over how to adapt their business and didn't know what to do next, right? So they sought someone that had that type of knowledge. So I think, there's an old stigma about once the consultant shows up, it means a bunch of people are getting fired and the business is going to look different, right? And um, for me, I try to encourage people to look outside for help. And I always make it a point to let them know that my objective is to just make their business better and try to point out some things that they may not have picked up on or things that I've learned through other engagements or the overall view of the industry. In doing that, the very first thing that I do is either a all hands on deck meeting, depending if they're in a single location, or I do one-on-one phone calls with the staff. And I ask a ton of questions. I don't come in there and pretend I have all the answers and just talk to the stakeholders or the C-suite. The first thing I do is tell them that I want to talk to your staff. I want to talk to your leadership team. And you learn from them that there's a certain direction you should be looking in. And then it allows me to go back and talk to the C-suite or the stakeholders about where we need to go. So and this has nothing to do with me doing this for the last 5 years. There's a lot of great consultants out there. I believe in it. And I think there's a lot of companies out there that maybe don't have it in the budget to put someone on staff full time, but there are opportunities and companies of consultants that could come in and help them fill a potential void if they're stuck somewhere.
Yeah, and I think a lot of businesses that maybe are siloed or you have leadership that aren't on the same page, you're going to be able to see those things differently than a business that, like you said, maybe it's owner operator and they hit a ceiling. Maybe they're a great thinker of product and developing, but maybe they're not great at sales, or maybe they don't know how to let go and start giving some of that work and delegating it accordingly, or even empowering people because they have to be too involved in micromanaging everything. And you can just imagine from small to large businesses how there's all these opportunities. And so, with that said, since we've kind of come to the end of our slot today, I would love to be able to end on when you're not working, when you're not consulting, when you're not working in the centers, when you're not working on the buying or selling of leads with companies. I understand that you're an avid traveler. So with that, when time permits, how are you using that to disconnect? Is there anything in particular you're doing to be able to recharge when doing that? And then obviously, how does that help you when you get back into the work mode?
Sure. Definitely a travel junkie. If I'm not working, I spend a lot of my free time researching and planning what the next trip might be. That took a lot of discipline, by the way. I still can't travel without my laptop or, checking in on things a time or two, but I've gotten better at being able to disconnect and focus on the family and enjoy the experience. Um, when I'm at home, if I'm not planning or researching travel, uh, love to get a good workout in to clear my head. Um, I think it's a little hard to shut the brain off just the way it's wired. So I even take enjoyment in, just kicking back and thinking about ways to improve what I have going on already in the different businesses or engagements. And although that sounds like work, it's a way to occupy my brain when it's not under pressure. So sometimes, you just can't 100% shut it off. But because I love what I do and I enjoy this industry and I enjoy the people, a lot of colleagues and people that I've known for years have become friends. So, I look at it almost like an extended family. So I'll spend that time trying to help people out or figure out how I could do things better. And of course, self-help, read, listen to some podcasts, audiobooks, do things where I could pick up nuggets for myself to try to get better every day.
Love it. Always being a student. So, Joe, there's going to be people that are going to want to connect with you after this. How best can they do it?
Probably the best way is through my website, saguaroglobal.com. It's SAGUARO global.com. My email address is joe.laskowski at that same URL, or LinkedIn. Super easy to find on LinkedIn. And otherwise, I'm at a lot of the events and I'm always hovering around somewhere. So feel free to walk up and introduce yourself if I'm out and about and I see you.
Perfect. Well, Joe, thanks so much for joining the show. It was great
Thanks for
having
having
you.
me, Chris.
We can always talk forever. So many great nuggets of value. And to our audience, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to First Contact Stories of the Call Center. We'll be back next month with another leader who's navigating the interaction between technology, regulation, human connection. So until then, I'm Christian Montez. Thanks for listening.